I hope this doesn't embarrass, but I was taken aback when I learned that this vigorous gentleman with whom I'd had several conversations, there's a vitality in him, and he runs regularly and is just full of life. And he told me that he is turning 81.
I am 81.
Correction, he just announced he is 81. 81 is the new 71, or maybe the new 61 when we have Dr. Esposito. Dr. Dalia Fahmy comes to us from the Long Island University in New York, and young as she is working on book number 4, and she has just received the chair of International Relations and Diplomacy. That's not even in your program. This is late-breaking news. We're very proud of her, and that simply recognizes her accomplishment and her abilities, and the fact that she will, through a long career ahead of her, continue to be, in her way, out in front as an imam. Well, those are our introductions, and we are going to simply make 2 quick comments. For those who wish to know, down the hall we have a prayer room set aside for Salah. For those who wish to partake of it, it's down the hall, and you may do so at any time throughout the day. And a final reminder that this session, all sessions, are being broadcast live. And so be aware in terms of attentive listening and silence, which was wonderful yesterday. We have that again today. So without further ado, Dr. Imam Esposito.
Thank you very much. I prefer Don, as in in Southeast Asia, I'm actually known as the Don of the Temple Mafia, because of all of the people who studied Islamic studies there. I was the first PhD. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Grant Underwood for an incredible job. We've had so many conversations in his planning that it's really clear. I mean, he's meticulous in planning for it. And also those that helped do that and those that have taken care of us here, in particular Jim Taranto, who managed to get me home last night. Not because I was drinking, but because these shoes sort of slip on snow. I want to embellish on Jack. What is Jack Brown's name again? Jack Brown, yes, my colleague, who commented that I'm often on planes. I just passed 3 million miles. So I'm actually about 51, but it's what it does to the body. I'm going to begin doing something that normally I don't do, and that is I want to be briefly autobiographical because it has to do with the way in which I want to indicate how Islam was being viewed when I was in graduate school in America, and then what happened when the Iranian Revolution came, etc. I was born and raised in an Italian Catholic neighborhood in Brooklyn. I left Paradise at 14 and entered the Capuchin Franciscan Fathers, and left the monastery at 24. I was not ordained, okay, just to make that point. I particularly have to do that with Catholic audiences. But that affected very much my view of the world. It was cosmopolitan New York, but actually I was in an Italian neighborhood, and as far as I could walk as a kid, it was all Italian neighborhoods. And it was totally Roman Catholic upbringing all through my master's degree. I became a Vatican II young theologian and taught at a women's Catholic college, and then went to Temple University in order to take a PhD in Catholic studies. It was the only university that was unique about it. It was a department of religion that was founded that dealt with all of the world's religions. So you majored in one religion, you minored in 2. And I was able to do a PhD in Catholic studies, whereas normally I'd have to go to a Catholic university, and I didn't want to do that at the time. I knew nothing about Arabs and Muslims. I had seen The Exodus, the movie, and the book I had read by, I think it was Leon Uris, And I thought that he was a historian of some, and the way he portrayed Arabs and Muslims didn't really make me want to even think about doing anything in it. But the department chairman, because I was in a track for Hinduism and Buddhism at that point, Zen Buddhism, suggested I take a course on Islam, and I declined. He suggested a second meeting. I declined. And a third meeting, a very soft-spoken guy sort of blew up and said, "What is it with you Catholics?" And his problem was that it was just at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, when many of us were leaving monasteries and nunneries, etc., and we're very involved, many of them, in the student union. And we're rather vocal with what they wanted. But he basically said that we were hiring a Muslim scholar, Ismail al-Faruqi, and I ought to do a course with him. Faruqi had written a book on Christian ethics, and he said, you two could vibe. I went to see Faruqi, and Faruqi said, "Well, let's plan your course of studies." I said, no, I'm only doing one course. About a month later, he called me into his office and said, University of Pennsylvania has a crash course in the summertime in Arabic. You really should take it. I said, "Well, why would I take Arabic?" He said, "In order to do Islamic studies." I said, "But if I'm not doing Islamic studies, why would I take Arabic?" He said, "Please sign it." So I signed it, figuring I'd never get it. I got it, and they paid me money in the summertime, and I decided it would be a good conversation at cocktail parties in the future. For whatever reason, Faruqi opened up a vision for me. He was my mentor. He and his wife were murdered at a certain point. And so I'm sorry. I am the stereotype of an emotional Italian. So don't ask me about my wife. Okay. But I suddenly discovered in his course that the way the world was constructed in those days was that Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam were all on one side, and Judaism and Christianity were on the other when it came to studying religion. So Islam had no connection there. And I looked, and what I saw was a kind of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition as far as I was concerned, which, by the way, when some of us began to write about that, became very controversial in terms of people being upset. But I won't go into why I can say Judeo-Christian Islamic, because other speakers have. But the recognition that Muslims have of previous revelations in the Torah, in the Gospels, and of Jesus and Mary, of the biblical prophets, etc. And so that fascinated me. But the question really became, why would I do Islam? Because as my colleagues said, who were all young Catholic theologians, you'll never get a job. There'll always be Catholic universities, so if there are cuts or whatever, there are always going to be job positions. And as another said, why would you go into that abracadabra field, which was very much the mentality at that time. Why? If you looked at America in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a country of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And there was a famous book that was written with that title. And the reason why Catholics were there was he was signaling in the study that we had finally arrived. So then rather than just talking about Judaism, Christianity, you had Catholics. But Muslims were invisible in America. It doesn't mean that they weren't Muslims, but they were seen as Lebanese or Egyptian, etc. Mosques were very invisible. One of the oldest was in Iowa. I often say to my Muslim friends when I went to Iowa, why'd your family come to Iowa? But anyway, and the other was the Boston Mosque, which wasn't in Boston, but was in Quincy, Mass, where most people didn't know how to get there. So Islam was invisible. It was invisible in a variety of ways in our educational system. Very few colleges and universities had courses in Islam. Primary and secondary school, no coverage. Today I have students who come in the first year of university, and many of them have taken world religions courses or even courses on Islam. I have a number of them that started studying Arabic in high school, completely different. Diplomats were not trained in the importance of knowing the areas of politics and culture and religion. When I went to Georgetown, I was able to take one of the titles. They told me I could take a title. I said, I don't think it would fit because you probably have a lot of people with the title Professor of Religion and International Affairs, because Georgetown is a school of international affairs. And they had no one. So it was invisible in the professional organizations, in the Middle East Studies Association. The American Academy of Religion had no coverage of Islam until Ismail al-Faruqi and some of his grad students in the end of the 70s petitioned. And then we had to be kind of tested over a couple of years in terms of was there, a constituency so that you'd have a permanent representation. And that didn't happen until the early to mid 1980s. With regard to our diplomats, our foreign service officers, it wasn't until around 1983, 1984, the Foreign Service Institute began to have speakers on Islam in the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And I used to do a fair amount of that in those days. Everything changed with the Iranian Revolution. Everything. Because before that, I could send out book contracts and get no answers. Or what happened was I sent out, I think it was like 50 publishers, and only 2 answered and said, great idea, no market. The Iranian Revolution came along, and I signed 3 book contracts in 5 weeks. And the reason was there weren't many people who were specialists. Most people were in a panic. The thing that saved a lot of people was that we had answering machines. So when New York Times would call, for many people, if they asked them about Shia Islam, not a clue. Even people that did degrees in Islamic studies, many of them really didn't do much with Shia Islam. There, all kinds of areas were really absent in terms of their representation there. But suddenly everybody was scrambling. Media, government, all wanted to be briefed, wanted to talk to people, and so that brings me to the final point of my biography. I quite literally say all the time, I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. I owe my Lexus coupe to somebody else, but I don't refer to the somebody else. But it really showed the market kind of approach and the market run. But what it really did also say is, where were we to understand anything? Tom Brokaw on the Today Show, when they were at the gate where the hostages were taken, he interrupted to say, let me tell you something about Islam. It's the 2nd largest of the world's religions. It has a book, the Quran, and a prophet named Muhammad. And that's all he said. But imagine the presumption in an educated America, that was the state we were in. And yet most Americans, if they went any place in the world, would expect that people would have heard the word Jesus, Bible, maybe Catholic. It's the level of not having any background, and then engaging Muslims by watching TV and seeing people in the streets of Tehran yelling death to America. It seems very empirical to people. Where do you go from there in terms of dealing with it? And so, in fact, it was the Iranian Revolution that was the lens through which many in the West came to see Islam and Muslims. And that became a dominant kind of coverage. Edward Said, a prominent scholar, as well as a public intellectual when it came to the Middle East, from Columbia in 1981, right after the Iranian Revolution, he wrote the following: for the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, government, the geopolitical strategists, and academic experts on Islam are all in concert saying, quote, Islam is a threat to Western civilization. What I am saying, Said said, is that negative images of Islam are very much more prevalent than any others, and that such images correspond not with Islam, with what Islam is, but to what prominent sectors of a particular society take it to be. Islam in the West, he said, a clash of civilizations. Those sectors have the power and the will to propagate their particular image of Islam. This image, therefore, becomes more prevalent, more present than all others. And I should note, Edward Said was an Arab Christian, not an Arab Muslim. By the 1990s, 10 years later, many people missed it, that Said had said this. 2 prominent academics who also had access to government and were looked to by government. Bernard Lewis in a piece called Roots of Muslim Rage, and then Sam Huntington with his article, The Clash of Civilizations. And that really stuck in. And Sam, who had a great publication record, that was the biggest book that he ever had. People wanted him all over the world. Muslim friends from Malaysia and stuff would ask if I could get him to go there. But in his first article, he talked about the fact that Islam had bloody borders. Not Muslim countries have bloody borders, but Islam has bloody borders. And in the book, he added, Islam has bloody innards, bloody innards. And on a TV program that I did with him, when he was asked to explain why he kept the former and then added the latter, he declined to respond. So there was a real difference. The next part I'm going to say has been cut out by my wife, but Grant said I can go a little over 30 minutes. I'll be going till about lunchtime, so just sit back and relax. The reality was, he and I did a debate in Saudi Arabia, and I didn't know him. He called me in my home as if we knew each other and said, "Are you going?" And we went. And as we were walking into this debate, and the debate was in Saudi Arabia, and you had a huge auditorium that held thousands of people, males, and then one next to it that had females. The guy who put it together ran up to me and said, "Please talk to Professor. He's going to talk about Islam and modernization and development theory. You know, the reason we invited him is to address the clash of civilizations." And indeed, there was a clash, within the audience. And it was an interesting clash because the man that really challenged him was a German who was the ambassador to North Africa and converted to Islam, and who was a Harvard graduate as well, and who really challenged him on this issue. But in those days, clash just caught and people bought into it. Islam came to be seen as a triple threat: historical, geographic, and demographic, meaning population. I have to tell you, I didn't know what demographic was. I have a limited vocabulary, having been raised in Brooklyn. Now, I remember when I first saw the word, I thought, who do I ask? I can't ask colleagues, because they'll wonder, you don't know what the hell that is, what the word means? Fortunately, my wife had been an English major, so she helped me. But the triple threat was out there, and it was clear. The Assistant Secretary of State, or one of them, asked to see me. And it was the very day when, about 2 hours before, I had signed a contract to write a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. And what he said to me is, I don't see Islam as a threat, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, I can see where global Islamic fundamentalism can be a threat. And he said, will Algeria be another Iran? And of course, I had to explain that A, enormous population difference, B, Islamically completely different, C, big difference in terms of wealth, military, etc. But the idea of even raising them to the same level. And that was very much where we were coming from. It was at that time that I was invited to Georgetown to start a center called the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And the donors were Arab, Christian, and Arab Muslim businessmen from the Gulf, and their concern was that there might be an Islamic threat. Now I tell you something that is supposedly literally true. The donor went to Kramer's bookstore, and his assistant pulled a book off the shelf, and it was my book, Islamic Threat. So he recommended me to the president, as it turned out. I call it a spirit-driven moment for him. So what did 9/11 really do? It ratcheted up and made global the reality of this threat. It reinforced the threat, that there was a global threat. It was a brilliant move by bin Laden to decide to attack the two major identifiers, as it were, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And so I'm told, or have been told, the intention was also to hit. And of course, last January 6th, we had some people who actually attempted that. But the reality of it is that he planned it that way. He planned it that way. And then subsequent to that, you had many similar attacks in London, in Spain, in Madrid, in Bali. So again, you get this wave, and finally you're getting the media coverage of it, and I'll have something to say about that. The media then catches on, and that really explodes and makes everything work out. Now, the thing, in all fairness to George W. Bush, on the one hand, I'll also do on the other hand, yes, he declared a global war on terrorism, and we can discuss that off this panel because that's not what we're about. But he went out of his way to say that there was a difference between, if you will, mainstream Islam and what these militants were doing. and that he wanted that distinction. And he said Islam is a religion of peace, and Al-Qaeda and their terrorists are doing their extreme things. But it then did become a problem when he used the word crusades. Some of you are old enough to remember that then he backed off that. He didn't realize that word would be a problem. And the Pentagon used the word infinite justice for some of what it was doing, which, created also, fed the problem that we had. But creating that phrase, global war on terrorism, in terms of the way in which people would see it, because I remember that the day when he talked about it, he was did a public announcement, and he had all this chief military, and I did a Fox News interview. And so the woman after it, she was asking me about the Muslim world, and I said, well, you really have to be careful about what countries you want to talk about and stuff. And she said, are you deaf? I've never had anybody talk to me that way. I said, excuse me, are you deaf? Did you just hear what he said? This is a global war on terrorism. We will go any place in the world where this is occurring. And of course, as you'll remember, we just had the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, etc. I remember doing a consulting job with British military, and they were very supportive. As you know, Blair was very supportive of Mr. Trump. But the chief presenter said, I wish the phrase global war wasn't used. There's no boundary to it, and how do you declare an end? What does it mean to declare an end? And I think that really stays there. At the same time, in a differing way from the UK, as my colleague Asma said the other day, where Running Mead had used the word Islamophobia in the UK, Islamophobia was not used in the United States until the year 2010. And that was the so-called mosque at ground zero, neither a mosque nor a ground zero. And people miss that. It was also based and very much inspired by the Jewish Y on 92nd Street, which means it was not only something for the community, but for the broader community. And it was tied into luxury apartments. But that didn't matter, and it was approved by the government. But you had people like Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer and others who are card-carrying Islamophobes who turned it into a national demonstration, etc. And that is what then led to an article at the time in Time magazine. The cover story was, is America Islamophobic? And the author went to an area in America, interviewed, etc., and basically the conclusion was that it is. And I remember doing interviews on CNN. CNN would bring you in and have you there for an hour or two and do segments so they could use it over a period of time. But what struck me was this very intelligent newscaster and her producer during the break said to me, what is this, what's happening? And I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. In other words, the existence of Islamophobia had been there in America for quite a while. So what is Islamophobia? This is the definition that I have here, comes from bridge.georgetown.edu. If you want information on Islamophobia globally, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. It's the bridge protecting pluralism, ending Islamophobia. And we have 1.1 followers on Facebook. I'm thinking of pulling us off Facebook, but my ego can't let go of it. Then we'll be down to 0, so I don't think I can quite do that. But the reality of Islamophobia is, and the way we would define it is, it's anti-Muslim attitudes and behaviors, an extreme fear and a hostility towards Islam and Muslim, an extreme fear, that's where the phobia fits in, towards Islam and Muslims, that often leads to hate speech, hate crimes, social and political discrimination. So it covers the kind of bases. It doesn't mean that you can't be critical about Islam and Muslims. So that's not the point. You can be critical about any religious tradition. We have freedom of speech, etc. It's that bias that's there that becomes an issue. The link between America's lack of familiarity about Islam and Muslims and negative views of the religion and people were documented in major polls. I'm going to refer to the Gallup poll a few times, and professionally, I'm supposed to say that I was a Gallup senior scientist. I was associated with it. I never knew what the heck the phrase senior scientist, but it was a nice title. You collect titles the older you get. It's kind of nice. I have other titles that are crude, but that's That has to do with people that don't like me. I forget this is being recorded, okay. That means when my wife sees it, we'll have a long conversation. The Gallup World Poll was a poll that was run from 2001 to 2007. It looked at the whole world, and it was about quality of life. Are you happy in your life? Do you feel economically secure? Do you feel... But it also did 35 to 40 Muslim countries and asked questions that were pertinent to Muslims. And also, Time Magazine and the New York Times in 2010 both reported that when the US respondents were asked what they admire about the Muslim world, 55% said nothing or I don't know. A majority did not know a Muslim. 33% disclosed that they believe that American Muslims were more sympathetic to terrorism. And 60% had negative feelings about Muslims. What does negative feelings mean? 49% of Americans believe that US Muslims were not loyal to the US. And Islam, this is the interesting thing, Islam was viewed even worse than Muslims were. People have this funny way of not being able to deal with, if you're dealing with the reality of things, saying Muslims do that. Islam can't do things, you know. But we'll see later on that somebody talked about Islam hates us. So Islam was viewed even more negatively. 59% of Americans said they had unfavorable views of the faith. You can bet that most of them knew nothing about the faith. I mean, you know, that is, given the state of where we were at that time. I mean, what they would know is maybe what they got from television, you know, or social media, but it wouldn't be as if they were people who had actually read something, you know, and really, you know, seriously approached it. 44% said Muslims are too extreme in their religious beliefs, which for me gets really interesting when you're dealing with other faiths. You know, there was a case in Boston in which a group, a religious group, but not one of the major world religions, was being seen as extremist and not scientific. And an ex-Jesuit was the lawyer for the defense. And he basically said to the judge, now this is in Boston, very Catholic, he said, you know, there's this other group too. He said, there's this religious group that believes that you can take bread and wine and change it into the very body and blood of Jesus Christ. And the judge dismissed the case. Okay. All right, now let's think about media. Again, Asma referred to some really good media spots, but there's one outfit that I deal with that I think has some interesting things to say. It's called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. And you can find a lot of this information, again, at Bridge, or if you look up Media Tenor's website. But here's what they did that was very different. They looked at 975,000 pieces. 975,000 pieces of American and European media. In 2001, they looked at it, and then in 2011. In 2001, when they looked at all this media and said, where are Islam and Muslims, they found that 2% of all the news about them in the Western media presented images of Muslim militants. And when it came to the vast majority of Muslims and coverage, 0.1%. So 2%, 0.1%. 2011, the 2% goes up to 25%. And one could say, well, the numbers, you know, there's a reason for an increase. There was a lot of terrorist actions. But the coverage of mainstream Muslims remained at 0.1%. 2015, it gets worse. 2015, the report that came out in 2016, but it was done in 2015, the interviews, was that Islamophobia has become normalized internationally. Why? 8 out of 10 stories, for example, in US, UK, and Germany were about militants and terrorists. Even those on mainstream Muslims, many of them, about 50%, equivocated. And when they talked about individual Muslims, now you would think they'd talk about maybe a Muslim terrorist, but they'd also talk about a Muslim that won some international awards, etc. No, it was all militants that were portrayed. I had cut out a reference to the New York Times, But again, if you're interested, it should be on Bridge, or you can write to me. A study of the New York Times over a 25-year period found that Islam was seen as more negative than the stories and coverage of the cocaine and a variety of other things that we would normally see as absolutely negative. So that's the reality on the ground that most people aren't aware of. Media Tenor brought out a study in 2020 that basically said things had not changed significantly. When you look at media coverage, now things have changed significantly on the ground. In some ways in the US things have gotten better, but they've also gotten a bit worse. In Europe things have gotten worse, and I'll make some mention to that. Asma referred to the organized Islamophobia network. When you look at the report that was done, the progress report called Fear, Inc., you were talking about $42.6 million going towards these outfits, okay? And that's based on IRS returns. But a study done in 2016 by CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, but also UC Berkeley Center for Race and Gender, issued a broader report that concluded that between 2008 and 2013, $205 million supported these kinds of websites and individual writers. 205 million. There's no alternative on social media presenting a different position. Bridge does not have $205 million. But I know that the LDS community is a successful community, and I'd be very happy. Just see me after I take a check, credit card, whatever you have. How has Islamophobia affected American elections? Reference was made to Obama's situation. But the interesting about Obama was not just the birth thing, that Mr. Trump was the main person putting it out. Also, he questioned his excellence at Harvard, and basically said if you really look into it, his record wasn't that good. And so even though he made the Harvard Law Review, which is prestigious, it was, et cetera. But more than that, when Obama was in the Detroit area, where you have one of the largest Muslim groups, they were doing a photo op with young people, and most of them, I think half of them were not hijab, and then a couple of them had a hijab on. Obama's people kind of eased and set up the photo op so that they wouldn't be seen. Also, Obama, who gave this incredible speech from Cairo about Islam and Muslims, etc., never went to a mosque in America until the very end of his term. He was in for 8 years, the very end. He went to a mosque in Turkey. I was there with him when he was there by coincidence. He went to a mosque in Cairo, but he did not, no photo op at, that really says something, because that's not the nature of President Obama. It was the reality of the political situation. When we move to recent elections, we find that in 2016, 2/3 of people in a poll reported, and it happens to be Mr. Trump supporters, that they believe that Obama is still a Muslim, that Obama is a Muslim. And I think it's his name, that goes that way, obviously, but that says the way we're kind of thinking. As a candidate, Mr. Trump advocated a temporary freeze on all foreign Muslim immigration, as well as monitoring or even the forced closure of American mosques. The result? His polls soared. A Republican friend of mine who's a Muslim and very much involved in the Republican Party, told me about a particular senator whose name I won't mention, a congressman. But anyway, he talked about him. He said, he gives this speech every now and then. And he said, in fact, it's when he needs funding. And he was from the New York area. And the funding goes up. So there are a lot of realities that feed this situation. When Anderson Cooper asked about Islam and how the president saw Islam, the president basically said, Islam is at war with the West. I think Islam hates us. There's a tremendous hatred, and we cannot allow people coming into the country who have that hatred. Now, there are Muslims that have a hatred, but they are a fraction of a fraction. It's not the whole group. So we're generalizing about the group. It's not the same as, but as an Italian American growing up at the time of the mafia, it was very common for people to think, and I came from Brooklyn, that I had connections to mafia or that I knew a lot of mafia people. Even when I was in the monastery, people who were devout Catholics, but of different ethnic groups, one in particular, and so that ethnic group is not going to be mentioned tonight, they thought it was just funny to do mafia jokes, but also talk as if I really, knew mafia, that kind of sort of generalization. So when you say Islam hates us and your audience hears that, they don't focus on, it's much better to just denounce ISIS and AQ, etc. They think there's something particularly about this religion. If you look at the body count historically, of violence done in the name of religion between Islam and Christians, Christians score very well historically. So, this is part of the reality that we deal with, especially when we're dealing with the average person who's busy every day. They work, they have a family, etc. And then depending on what news outlet they have, and especially if they don't look at multiple news outlets, it's almost natural that you're going to have that situation. So what about American Muslims? And here I'll move to my conclusion. When I'm in an audience, I look and say, holy jeez, he's over time. American Muslims and Muslims in Europe, the great thing about being up here is he can't drag me off the stage. He won't dare. He gave my age. It'll look like he's really taking advantage of me. But who are these Muslims? What do we know about them? There he is. I think I'm being discriminated against because of my sex. I won't play on that word. The reality of it is Muslims are integral, and I love talking about the mosaic, because it used to be the melting pot routine. And the melting pot means we all become one, but what in fact, even is that one? But of this mosaic, and we look at the data, what are the facts that we have? And this is data, by the way, is over the last 10 years. It's not just yesterday. So I pulled it off Gallup, Pew, and an outfit called ISPU. I'll refer to them in a second. In recent years, what we've seen is that American Muslims, the reports are, they are economically, educationally, and socially integrated into the U.S. Economically, educationally, and socially. In fact, some polls, as much as 10 years ago, talk about a significant number of Muslims who make $100,000 or more. Okay? That doesn't mean that there aren't, poor Muslims, etc. 40% have had college degrees versus 29% of other Americans overall. Muslim women are statistically as likely as Muslim men to hold college and postgraduate degrees. This is in contrast to many Muslim countries in terms of access to education. Economically, Muslims are as successful as others who are average Americans. They're diverse professionals, doctors. The largest groups are doctor groups. My wife used to always worry because I do a lot of traveling and speaking. I was going out to Detroit. I wasn't feeling well. I sat there. I have more doctors in an audience if I get sick. And it so happened I didn't feel well. So I just announced, would the doctors in the house raise their hand? So you see all the hands. And then I said, now I'd like those that don't have children to put their hand down. And then I said, and those that have children, would you leave your hand up if your kid is a doctor? And it's incredible. As one father said to me, bragging about his son, he's just wonderful, but I love my daughter. I'm so close to my daughter. And she's a lawyer. And that's okay. That's okay. Okay. They're also blue-collar workers and laborers. I had a Muslim driver who said to me, he's from Pakistan. He said, I work here and I go home to Pakistan for a couple of months. As a result, my wife can have somebody helping in the house, etc. She wants to come to America. I said, you're not going to have the same life. We're going to be in a small apartment, So she comes, and he said to me, Professor, people think that we are overly protective of our women. I tell my wife every day, get a job. Get a job. He said, I've got to get her out of the house. So the reality of it is this broad spectrum economically and professionally Among non-working, 31% have full-time students as compared to 10% of the general population in America. But what about Muslim religious views? Now, here I'm talking about American Muslim religious views, okay? I'm not talking about, Muslims in a particular country. It would be just as with, Christianity, it can vary from country to country, et cetera. 84% strongly emphasize shared values with Christians and Jews. A major Pew survey as in 2011, not just right now, found Muslims held mainstream views. A majority of Muslims believed other faiths can lead to eternal life, as compared to 64% of Christians in terms of their position. Here's the great one. 93% of Muslims have close non-Muslim friends. A majority claim most of their friends are non-Muslim. Now watch this. In contrast, 75% of white Americans reported 91% of their friends are white, and that they had one black friend or one Latino friend or one Asian friend. And I remember in the early days, which given my age, it could be any decade, but I remember talking to Muslim audiences and saying, you'll know when you become part of the mosaic is when you wake up someday and you just say to yourself, who are my friends? And suddenly you realize so many of your friends are not of your faith. The way I sort of put it as a Catholic, and that you weren't even self-conscious of it. It wasn't that you were going out to say, well, I got to, tell Fulan to go and find a Protestant, then go find some LDS friend, and we'll look good in the polls. I mean, the reality of it is that's just the reality of the community, because remember, the community now, in addition to African-American Muslims who've been here for hundreds of years, the American non-African American community are third and fourth generation now. So, they're as American, if not more American than I am. I'm sort of second generation. The Public Religion Research Institute and the Washington Post provided some of that data that I just mentioned to you. Okay, in conclusion, I would be remiss if I didn't mention to you that the situation in France and Austria is terrible in the last year. Muslim civil society is under siege from Macron and his government, and also the situation in Austria. One of my senior researchers, who's a PhD, is a professor, et cetera, he and 29 other families in Austria had 500 military and security forces in the middle of the night, went to these 30 homes, not all 500 to each home, broke into the house with guns drawn. He asked them when they went to go to the room where his children were, please don't, walk in with your guns drawn. They were drawn. They seized all their electronic equipment. They froze all their bank accounts. They also froze their ability to sell their house. And in Austria, the government has 2 to 3 years to decide whether they're going to indict you, which means if you really want to, I can't use the word I wanted to use. If you really wanted to what? I can't say. Stick it to them rather than screw. Right, okay. Stick it to them. If you really wanted to stick it to them, you don't have to say anything. And then thank God, after all of this happened, and it was really becoming very dangerous, for people in terms of their future, people in another sector of the Austrian government threw all of that out. But that's where we are. And in France, the situation, they haven't thrown it out. It's a major issue that occurs. And just globally, to finish up, think about the fact that globally, if you look at China, you have more than 1 million Uyghurs who both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have said have been subject to genocide. In Myanmar, you have more than 1 million Rohingya. And in India, where you have 200 million Muslims, there have been incredible cases of discrimination, including talking about COVID jihad, blaming Muslims for COVID, and then discovering that they had to back off that. They also talk about marriage jihad, that Muslims in India or even in other countries are seeking to marry non-Muslims and then also make them become Muslims. So we're looking at a phenomenon in a world in which, in particular when I look at the West, but also in a world overseas, more globally, a world that we would have expected, for some of us here who are old enough and have had a number of decades behind us, that that world was going to get better and be safer and be more pluralistic and be more compassionate, or just social justice. I like social justice better. I happen to like compassion a lot, but when you say compassion, some people, it's a soft topic. But in terms of social justice, and it's gotten worse. So for me, our obligation as citizens, and those of us who are people of faith and no faith, is to really address these issues in any way that we can. In universities, having courses, running programs, for people who have an opportunity to and can have discussion groups where people get together of different faiths and discuss things, for people who are voters to be very much involved, and certainly in interfaith relations. The good news in interfaith relations is that it's become far more inclusive. I can tell you, I was probably part of the first Muslim, Christian, Jewish dialogue in the United States. That's absurd. Even given my age, that's absurd. You know? And it was at a time also when I was asked to participate in a dialogue, and I said, so what would you like me to talk about? Vatican II? They said, oh no, you're going to be the Muslim. I said, this is in the Boston area. I said, well, can't you find Muslims? They said, yeah, but a lot of them are computer scientists, et cetera, and they don't, you know, they don't do. Now that's changed, but I think that that's really what it seems to me, what our obligation today in the world that we're in today is to build a world where, and certainly in America, a world where we can have our differences and yet see everybody as having an equal right to citizenship, part of the mosaic. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Dr. Asfaruddin asked me, did they mic you up? I said, I'm from New Jersey. I don't need a mic. Dr. Underwood, BYU, the Kennedy Center, thank you so much for having me and for letting me be part of this important conversation. Dr. Esposito, or the Godfather, it's always an honor to be in your presence, really. To the faculty, to the students here, thank you, but really to all of our new friends. It's been an incredible few days here, and really, especially with you, Dr. Underwood, we've developed a kind of kindred spirit, and so I appreciate all of this. Thank you. In 2015, in Brooklyn, New York, close to the campus where I'm a professor, a man was stabbed in the stomach in front of his wife and 5-year-old child. The assailant allegedly said, "I'm going to stab you because you're Arabic and you deserve it." Hours after the first Muslim travel ban was to take effect, a mosque in Victoria, Texas, erupts in flames. An Islamic school in Houston is burned down. And I'm going to return to these toward the end of my talk. According to CNN, in 2015, there were 63 arson attacks on mosques, the highest number. According to the FBI, there has been a 17% increase in Islamophobic hate crimes that has been consistent over the past 5 years, 17% increase for the past 5 years every year, stating that this has been one of the most intensely anti-Muslim time periods in American history. Now, attacks on mosques are often used as the measure of Islamophobia, but this is quite limited. It's beyond just the desecration of mosques and Muslim community spaces, but also the physical attack on Muslims and Muslim-looking men. Sikh men who wear turbans who are not Muslim have come under attack because it's assumed that they are Muslim. Muslim women who wear a headscarf tend to be attacked much more than men. The outward symbols of Islam, mosques, turbans, headscarves, are being attacked not anything more other than the dehumanization of those individuals. Fear of Islam has become more and more prominent in everyday political discourse, especially in the past decade, from nationwide anti-Islam rallies, the controversies surrounding several mosque zonings, the illegal surveillance of Muslim student associations, attempts to pass anti-Sharia legislation in 24 states, and the vitriol that was coming out of the 2005 Republican primary questioning whether Muslims in office can be trusted. It seems that anti-Muslim sentiment is on the rise. According to Gallup, 48% of Muslim Americans, 48% of Muslim Americans say they have experienced racial or religious discrimination. And unfortunately, we've seen the end result of this with the execution-style murders of 3 young Muslims in North Carolina, the burning down of the mosques and the arson attacks on the Islamic schools, and when 2 people in Michigan were asked if they were Muslims and they responded in the affirmative, they were stabbed repeatedly. Not to mention the violent attacks on the 2 imams in New York City close to the campus where I teach. Political campaigns include statements that the U.S. is a Judeo-Christian nation, indicating that this Islam has no place here, that a Muslim president can't be trusted, that Muslims should not be included in cabinet positions, that mosques should be closed, that we need a Muslim registry. Essentially, people running for the highest office believe that America should exclude Muslims from the definition of what it means to be American. During President Obama's 2015 State of the Union address, when he stated that the United States is a nation that will not tolerate increasing anti-Semitism, the entire chamber stands up and erupts in applause, rightfully so. But in his next breath, when the president says that America is a country that will stand against rising anti-Muslim sentiment, the entire chamber was silent. Yet American Muslims heard this very loud and clear. Muslims don't belong, and our elected officials seem to agree. That is Islamophobia. Islamophobia, we've heard several definitions, essentially is defined as the unfounded, irrational fear or hostility towards Islam and Muslims that's perpetuated by negative stereotypes, resulting in bias and discrimination and marginalization, and the exclusion of Muslims from American social, political, and civic life. So yes, there is a political objective here, the marginalization of Muslims from civic and political and social life. Now, irrationality leads to the propagation of certain myths about Muslims that are unfounded. And it's these myths that concern us most, because they're not true. For example, when a certain famous talk show pundit that comes on a cable news channel that begins with the letter that comes after E, says that 40% of Muslims support terrorism. What does this mean? If there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and I know an uncle will come up to me afterwards and say, no, there's 1.8 billion because he had something to do with it. I'm using the 1.6 billion because I'm dealing with a specific data set. That if that is going to be true, that means 640 million Muslims in the world would have to support terrorism, and this is a falsehood. If the population of Tunisia is 11 million, and Morocco is 33 million, and Libya 6, and Jordan 6, and Indonesia 250, and Malaysia 30, and Pakistan 192, add to that the 172 million Muslims living in India, that means every single one of those people, in every single one of those countries, would have to support terrorism for that one figure to be true. When we know that all of the people in the countries that I've just indicated live in countries with either democratically elected leaders or are striving for democracy and freedom, have had women in leadership positions, and of course don't forget the Arab Spring or the revolutions that happened and continue to happen that have proven the bankruptcy of terrorist ideology. So this falsehood that perpetuates that unfounded myth is still being used. When conservative pundit Ben Shapiro, the editor-at-large of Breitbart and the co-founder of Truth Revolt, says that 76% of Muslims are radical. 76% of Muslims are radical. What is he saying? He's misrepresenting a Pew study done in Muslim-majority countries that asks citizens if they want religious courts or religious judges to be in dispute resolutions of family or property issues just for Muslims. So 76% of Muslims in Pakistan say yes, they would prefer religious courts or religious judges to decide family or property disputes only for Muslims. He extrapolates from this that then 70% of Muslims in Pakistan support Sharia. Sharia is radical. Pakistan having 179 million Muslims means that 135.4 million Muslims in Pakistan are radical, and he extrapolates that to the entire Muslim world. Sharia will be dealt with on the coming panel, so I'll leave that. But the insinuation is not just happening in the margins or in these spaces. This insinuation was used in the congressional hearing recently held, Hate Crimes and the Rise of White Nationalism, where Dr. Abu Salha, the father of two of the girls that were killed execution style in North Carolina, his two daughters and son-in-law were shot to death, and he's testifying on the rise of white nationalism, is repeatedly asked to explain and defend his Muslim faith as not inherently violent. He's first asked by Mort Klein, a co-panelist and defender of President Trump's "There Were Good People" in 2017 at the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville. Representative Jackson Lee first offers her sympathies to Dr. Abu Salha, and she asks him, "Did you teach your children to hate? Did you teach your daughters to hate?" "Absolutely not, Congresswoman," Dr. Abu Salha says, before talking about his children's volunteer work and his own role on the mosque board. "We definitely make sure that anybody who is racist or hateful is out." She follows up, "So by the very fact of being Muslim, you're not filling your children or those in the mosques with falsehoods?" He says, "We fight this, actually." The next questioner, Representative Johnson, says he offers condolences because his, again, two daughters and son-in-law were killed execution style, but then asks him, "Does Islam teach to hate Jewish people?" Again, Dr. Abu Salha says, "According to the Quran, it says killing any human being is akin to killing all of humanity, and reviving a soul is akin to reviving all of humanity." It was 3 hours of testimony before Dr. Abu Salha was asked a single question on the rise of white nationalism that took his daughters' lives. The rise of white nationalism or white supremacy, also this narrative on Sharia, came in the confirmation hearing of Judge Qureshi, where he was asked, "What do you know about Sharia?" And his answer, "Oh, I don't know anything." The question is problematic, but so is the answer. Because he's forced to dissociate himself from what? This scary thing, the S word, Sharia. What was once on the periphery and on the fringes is now coming from within the core of our political establishment. My research on the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment in the run-up to an election as a strategy to foment fear for electoral victory that is created and funded by a formerly marginalized group has been leading to the mainstreaming of the anti-Muslim sentiment from the periphery to the seat of the presidency. And this has long-lasting effects socially, creating the us versus them dichotomy, politically, paving the way for discriminatory policies, and in the terms of articulation of rights, cementing inequality. The gradual and extensive shifting of anti-Muslim rhetoric from the margins of American life to its political mainstreaming is the relationship, or the result of a relationship, between a tight network of anti-Muslim interest groups and a corresponding faction of willing politicians in need of grassroots exposure. Coupled with the mutually beneficial relationship with the conservative wing of the national media, anti-Muslim messaging is being amplified. And so where does this come from? I'm going to talk about 2010 as a crescendo year, where this nativist anti-Muslim trend, through the roots of this movement, can be seen right to the beginning of President Obama or Barack Obama's rise in 2004. By 2008, What were once localized birthers and rumors on the internet were already being turned into national talk show-worthy topics of discussion, all of them representing the worst of this conspiratorial post-9/11 era paranoia. 2010 was a climax because the trend was not simply of how the Islamophobia network began to take fuller shape by this point, but because of the national hysteria surrounding the Victory Mosque or the Ground Zero Mosque, which I'll talk more about, and the national movement to ban Sharia law in several states. These national subjects were obvious wedges that the Republican politicians clung to for use in their campaigns, and they were very successful. Beyond the electoral success that many derived from these episodes in American hysteria, the conclusion of my research finds that the main victim of such prejudicial political movement has been the tenor or the climate of politics in the United States today and its mainstreaming, particularly around elections and within the particular parts of the Republican Party. Now, the candidacy of Barack Obama provided a kind of opening for a specific network of right-wing groups to ally themselves with the increasingly radical wing of the Republican Party, fueled by this anti-Muslim rhetoric. The anti-Muslim rhetoric was an attempt to counter the international appeal of President Obama, or candidate Obama at the time, combined with his non-white skin, symbolizing a new chapter in American societal evolution that certain segments of the conservative movement were fearing. Now, the rumors of the future president's religion, beliefs, through this cumulative effect of several organized processes, began to make their way into the narrative. The strategy was multi-pronged. A documentary film, Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West, was distributed to more than 28 million voters in swing states. 28 million voters. Rumors about his Islamic/Muslim faith have been around since his 2004 keynote address at the Democratic National Convention had become part of the question, where he actually had to put out a website, which is now defunct, Fight the Smears, which clarified everything about his faith and his religion. The matter, of course, is indicative of a deeper fear of anti-Muslim sentiment. And since the idea of a Muslim president now seemed to be threatening to US national identity, an outlet called Insight Magazine, the same company that also publishes the Washington Times, published a story citing how President or then candidate Obama attended a Wahhabi-oriented madrasa that taught the most intolerant forms of Islam. The rumor was never substantiated, but it made it to Fox News, on Glenn Beck's show, The New York Post, before CNN sent a journalist to Indonesia to investigate the matter further. The notoriously anti-Muslim investigative Project on Terrorism often wrote about how the US is being Arabized and Islamized by Muslims, especially at this moment in the lead up to the election. The 2010 midterm election marks a point where the anti-Muslim network of interest groups seem to have reached their full influence in American politics from an electoral standpoint, through external circumstances that favored its rise. The two parallel events that I mentioned earlier, the Ground Zero Mosque hysteria and the national campaign to ban Sharia law at the state level. In 2009, in the New York Times, they published a front-page story on the Cordoba Project, or Park 51. Pamela Geller published a blog post on her Atlas Shrugs at the same time, decrying that project amounts to a victory mosque for radical Islamists to celebrate their win on 9/11. She's talking about the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which, as Dr. Esposito said, is not at Ground Zero and not a mosque. There actually is a mosque very close to Ground Zero. During this time, between her, Robert Spencer, David Horowitz, the Jihad Watch, Front Page Magazine, there was the radical Islamist agenda being spoken of. The hysteria that summer for someone on the East Coast, especially in New York City, and the distribution of a pamphlet called Obama in Islam led to the protests that took place on our streets against Muslims, the encroachment, and this so-called Victory Mosque. It led to these elected officials winning their seats. However, as soon as the election is over, the hysteria went away. It was never about the mosque. It was never about this cultural center. It was about getting into office on the backs of Muslims. Former Republican Majority Leader Newt Gingrich made Sharia law his project. There was, in November, same year, 2010, Oklahoma became the first state in the US to pass a state-level constitutional amendment, State Question 755, banning Sharia law from being practiced in the state. Though the courts actually struck down the law later, it was the beginning of a nationwide movement that helped politicians present an anti-Muslim rhetoric to their base. When former Republican Majority Leader Newt Gingrich makes this his project, for example, in 2015, he told an audience at the Voter Value Summit in Washington, D.C., we should have a federal law that says Sharia law cannot be recognized by any court in the United States. Such a law will let judges know that no judge will remain in office that has tried to use Sharia law. Now, these words not only prompted a standing ovation, they led to 23 states having considered bills banning Sharia. Though only a few have passed, the purpose was never the passing of the bills. The purpose was the hysteria. That is Islamophobia. Now, some Republican members of the US Congress even endorsed a memorandum at the time, Sharia, the Threat to America, at a press conference on the Capitol. And this being talked about as the mortal threat, calling for its ban throughout America, was really the ability of these elected officials to ride into office on the backs of Muslims, this hysteria, and as soon as the election is over, there goes the hysteria. It's this moment that marks a kind of climax year for the influence and political success of the Islamophobia network in its relationship with willing Republican members of Congress. The ultimate goal of this effect has not only been just electoral, but rather the kind of rhetorical and grassroots network to facilitate the movement of anti-Muslim bigotry from the margins of American life to its mainstream place in politics. So the propagation of the falsehoods has a political and social objective. Now, these and other falsehoods have led to the scaring of people about Islam and Muslims and making them distrustful and fearful of their fellow Americans. This is further perpetuated by those negative stereotypes that result in bias and discrimination and marginalization and the exclusion of Muslims from civic and political life. In essence, hindering the ability of Muslims to participate in civic life. But this is antithetical to what it means to be American. Now, for Muslims, it's not a post-9/11 phenomenon. The notion of, well, what about the Muslims? They're not like us is not new. Washington Irving's biography of the Prophet was a bestseller in the early 1840s. Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad promoted stereotypes of Islam as an extreme religion. The Great World's Fairs all promoted stereotypes of the Middle East and Muslims. Silent movies such as Rudolph Valentino's The Sheik help promote the stereotype. The film industry, of course, needs its own conference, as does the cartoon industry. But there's an entire body of literature on this, and if you really want to study the depiction of bad guys, just watch any Chuck Norris movie. But as Dr. Esposito said towards the end, Muslims are everywhere. Over 20,000 physicians on the East Coast. They're driving your taxis, feeding you on the street, heading your banks, your hospitals, fixing your teeth, and paving your roads. Muslim Americans both died on 9/11 and helped erect the steel beam of One World Trade Center today. Muslim Americans have been part of the very fabric of this country since its start. In a 2007 book entitled Muslim Veterans of American Wars, lists the names of hundreds of Muslim American servicemen and women who fought in every war going back to the American Revolutionary War. Yes, there were Muslims who fought in the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and even the War on Terror. As Americans, for America. Muslim scholars, 20% of whom were women, were among the slaves brought from Africa to help build this country while trying to preserve their Islamic identity that was under attack and deemed illegal. The acceptance of Islam and Muslims, the embrace of Muslims as active members of society was the norm After all, it was President Grover Cleveland who appointed Alexander Russell Webb as the ambassador to the Philippines. Alexander Russell Webb, a Muslim, in the 1800s, that started the first mosque on Broadway in New York City, where he invited his friends, Oscar Wilde and Louisa May Alcott, and even President Cleveland himself to attend. And on a local note, he also served in the Rutherford, New Jersey Board of Education. When Benjamin Franklin helped establish the non-denominational religious meeting house in Philadelphia, he emphasized its non-sectarian nature by saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach Mohammedanism, which is what they called Islam to us, he would find this pulpit at his service. Now, why is all of this relevant? It's because this is so antithetical to the fabric of our country. When President Obama was running, when he was candidate Obama, remember this question of, well, what if he's a closet Muslim? His father was a Muslim. It led to the question of, can a Muslim be president? Believe it or not, it wasn't the first time this question had been asked. On July 30th of 1788, William Lancaster, a delegate to the North Carolina Convention to ratify the Constitution, is projecting his fears for the future of the country. And he's saying, and I quote, "But let us remember, we are forming a government for millions not yet in existence. I have not the art of divination. In the course of 400 or 500 years, I don't know how it will work. This is most certain, that a papist might occupy that chair, that a Mohammedan might take it, and I see nothing against it." The chair he's referring to is the presidency of the United States. Could a Muslim be president? Lancaster, an anti-federalist, is predicting such a scenario in the certainty of Article 6 of the Constitution that if it were approved, the second clause would mandate that no religious litmus test would be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And so when he's talking about this, he's actually referencing the issue of Muslims or Mohammedans in 8th century parlance becoming central to the definition of American ideals and political and religious rights. Now, this is a unique moment in American constitutional history where Muslims are becoming symbolically embroiled in the definition of what it means to be an American citizen. And so in this very discussion on the American Constitution in the 1700s, we see again the definition of what it means to be an American citizen and the question of what about them. So this debate over the ratification of the Constitution in North Carolina of Muslims turns into a question of the potential of Muslims as American citizens, when at the time the most contemporary depictions of Islam were as political and theological threats. And so what emerges from this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? That the debate also contained within it implication for Catholics and Jews who were compared at the moment to these heated exchanges to Muslims. So the result of this debate that took place over the ratification of the Constitution in North Carolina, that there was an agreement that there would be no religious litmus test. And it forced the Federalists to defend the future possibility of a Muslim president. Think about it. Why, in spite of everything that I'm talking about, do non-Muslims, do Americans come out and support Muslims and insist that we are Americans? Especially at that moment in the face of the anti-Islam rallies. The ideals that this country was founded on is that actually most Americans do hold dear. When Thomas Jefferson envisioned a country that was a safe space for people of all religions, a neutral religious ground for Christians and Jews and Mohammedans and Hindus and atheists, it wasn't meant to be exclusionary, but on the contrary, predicated on neutrality. Of course, we know based on Dr. Jackson's talk yesterday, might not have worked, but this is the core essence. But according to Gallup, 86% of Americans today see Islam in a negative light. And this is worse than it was 1 week after 9/11. And this is because those very American values are becoming increasingly undermined. Islamophobia has led to the return of an exclusionary identity, where Muslims are the threat, where they represent change, And the inclusion of Muslims would mean a redefinition of what it means to be American. And so this cannot happen. And this irrationality is the heart of Islamophobia. And it's toxic. And as strong as it is, it's not new. But it's always been inherently against American values. And so what are all of the effects of this on Muslim identity? When our identity is constantly defined for us, when Muslims are told, you are not us, and then they're constantly reacting against narratives and theoretical frames that have already been decided. And these pre-established frames, we know, are limited and irrational, and so sometimes become limited by those frames. And so a judge can say, I know nothing about Sharia. When we're stuck constructing identity as a reaction, when we're defining Islam against Americanness, against a limited understanding of what it means to be American and what Islam is, then in essence, we're defining ourselves against irrationality. And Islamophobia is irrational. And so what we need to recognize is that we can't accept those theoretical frames that have already been pre-established for us. And if we don't challenge those theoretical frames and establish new ones, then we're reifying those frames. When Gallup released a study of American Muslims followed by ISPUs, we learned that American Muslims, especially American Muslim women, are one of the most highly educated religious minority groups. That Muslim Americans are one of the most economically stable economic groups. Meaning, for example, in parts of New Jersey where there's a big concentration of Muslims, during the 2008 economic crisis, the housing crash, those areas didn't crash because Muslims are not allowed to engage in risky economic behavior. Which means also, Muslim Americans have the highest degree of economic gender parity. We earn as much as men. Basically, statistically speaking, Muslim Americans are productive, educated, civic-minded individuals. In one of their most recent study, Gallup finds that Muslim Americans are the staunchest opponents of violence, especially attacks on civilians, compared with members of other religious minority groups. My colleague at the University of Seattle conducted a study that finds that the more mosque-going you are, the more you attend a mosque, the more civic-minded you become. Because you go to the mosque, you learn about what's happening in the community, and you start to serve it. My former advisor at Princeton University released a study that indicates that the more you understand the Quran, the more pro-justice for all you become. Not just for Muslims. Justice is not just for us. Justice for all. But knowing all of this, how does Islamophobia continue to affect Muslim Americans, especially our young people? It actually affects youth a lot. The average 18-year-old today in 2021 was born 2 years after 9/11, which means their entire formative years, everything, has been shaped by this post-9/11 world where Muslims are suspect or suspicious. Negative perceptions today, as I said, are worse than they were 1 week after 9/11. The birth of the Islamophobia industry, $50 million a year to tarnish the image of Islam in the West as anti-West, anti-women, anti-Semitic, anti-justice, angry, and anti-everything, is a business. What this also means for our youth is that they're increasingly seeing that their odds are stacked against them. It's crazy how second-generation American Muslims feel like they belong more than third and fourth-generation American Muslims. And this ultimately shapes how they identify, because when you feel like you don't belong and you're told that you don't belong, you might start to believe that you don't belong. In a 2017 Yaqeen study, where I'm on the board, the study documented the harmful effects of Islamophobia and this rhetoric on the religious identity and perceptions of Muslims in urban American settings, where it found that 1 in 3 Muslim children doesn't want to tell others that they are Muslim. And 1 in 2 don't know that they can be both American and Muslim. That dichotomy Dr. Jackson talked about Islam and the West, that they believe that they cannot be both. And 1 in 6 pretend not to be Muslim. Again, the Islam and West binary, so central to this worldview, at the expense of Muslims, is successful. Islamophobia is being internalized by young Muslims in America. who see themselves as separate from civic and political life. Islamophobia has a political objective. After former President Trump signed the first executive order, the Muslim ban, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll conducted not long after that, 48% of Americans surveyed said that they agree with the ban. And then a Rasmussen poll said 57% said that they agree with the Muslim ban. However, there are signs that, well, hopefully this is going to backfire at some point. In a 2017 Pew survey, Islam scores 48 on a large sample of size of Americans that indicate, where it used to be 40, that, well, maybe Muslims are not so scary. The Pew data published, almost half of respondents said that they have had someone reach out to express support for their religion within the past year, compared to 37% in 2011 and 32% in 2007. That maybe there's a level of allyship forming. If you remember, after the first Muslim ban, while we did have all those arson attacks, what did we also see at airports throughout the country? What did we see in airports in New York City? We saw people running to them to support their fellow Muslims coming from throughout the world. In a New York City airport, when it was time to pray and people started praying, we had our American neighbors applauding and protecting their prayer. And so all is not bleak. When the second Muslim ban was instituted and there wasn't the permissibility of protest in New York City, certain people protested anyway. The first 17 people to be arrested were 17 rabbis who said, "We know where this leads, not on our watch." And so what this means is that in our heart, Americans still believe in those American ideals. It also led, in the past 2 years, for over 700 Muslims to run for public office. And 61% of those 700 are Muslim women. Now, to bring this full circle, in conclusion, remember the 2 arson attacks I talked about in Texas? In the case of the school in Houston, the Muslim community gathered and testified in the sentencing hearing, asking for leniency against the arsonist, against the arson charges, saying that if we're going to rebuild this community, we need to rebuild it together. The Muslim community who suffered the burning down of their Islamic school, the leaders testified in the sentencing hearing asking for leniency because we have to rebuild this community. And in the case of the burning down of the small mosque in Victoria, Texas, I'm on the board of the Islamic Scholarship Fund, and we've funded a documentary that will be coming out on PBS as a docuseries by a talented producer, Lee Lu, and it's called A Small Town in Victoria. And I'm not allowed to give out a lot of what's happening. She made me swear. But there are 2 co-founding board members of this mosque, a physician who's of South Asian descent and a physician who's of Egyptian descent. They co-founded a mosque many decades ago as a space for them to exercise their religious freedom and to build a community. They've been doctors in the area for over 40 years. And when she interviews them, and especially one doctor, a neonatologist, he's very emotional. He feels very hurt that maybe he lived with this false consciousness that this has always been his community and his neighborhood. And then she interviews the parents of the arsonist. And the parents of the arsonist tell her, "Our son was born premature. We never thought he was going to make it. His life was saved by some neonatologist." The neonatologist is the founding board member of the mosque that this young arsonist burnt down. And the realization is very compelling in this documentary. And the pain runs deep in this community because the arsonist actually came from a neighboring town, a small town in Victoria. And with the community divided, you also had a community rally around the mosque in Victoria to help it rebuild. And in one interview, a trucker, every stereotype of a trucker from Texas, is asked, he says, "I can't believe this happened. They might be Muslim, but they're our damn Muslims." And so although the pain runs deep, healing is possible. And in this community, and in conversations around this community, and in conversations we've been having in the past 2 days, where we're opening our eyes to certain ugly realities that many communities face, if we're going to move beyond them, and if we're going to redefine the narrative, it's going to take these deep conversations that many people are having in the face of some of the ugliest moments in our modern American history. Thank you.